Marcus, we're restructuring the executive team. Your services are no longer required." The words came from Harrison Blake, the man I'd helped build into a CEO. 25 years of my life dismissed in a single sentence delivered across his mahogany desk. I was 52 years old, Chief Operating Officer of Apex Industries, and until that Tuesday morning, I believed loyalty meant something. Harrison didn't even look up from his tablet as he spoke. Vanessa from HR sat beside him, her expression carefully neutral. I'd hired her 6 years ago when she was fresh out of college. Now she couldn't meet my eyes. "Effective immediately," Harrison added. "Security will escort you out." I nodded once, stood, and walked toward the door. My hand touched the brass handle I'd replaced during our office renovation in 2019. "Marcus," Harrison called. I turned. "Leave your company phone and access cards with security." "Understood," I said, and left. No argument. No questions. Just that one word hanging in the air like smoke. What Harrison didn't know was that I'd seen this coming for months. And I'd been preparing. I started at Apex Industries in 1999 when it was just 12 employees in a rented warehouse in Detroit. Harrison's father, William Blake, founded the company making industrial fasteners. Nothing glamorous, but necessary. Every car, every airplane, every building needed what we made. I was employee number 13, hired as operations manager. William saw something in me, a kid from the East Side who understood manufacturing and wasn't afraid of 18-hour days. "Marcus," he told me during my second week, "this company will either make us rich or break us trying. You in?" I was in. For the next decade, I worked beside William, learning everything about the business. When he died in 2009, Harrison inherited the company. He was 31, fresh from business school, full of ideas about scaling and market penetration. "Dad built a foundation," Harrison said at William's funeral. "Now we build an empire." And we did. Sort of. I handled operations while Harrison handled image. He loved the spotlight, the conferences, the magazine profiles. Fine by me. I loved the work. By 2015, Apex had grown into a $200 million operation. 3 facilities, 400 employees, contracts with major automotive and aerospace companies. I'd negotiated most of those deals, built the relationships, solved the problems when production issues threatened deadlines. Harrison took credit publicly. I didn't care. William had taught me that results mattered more than recognition. But things changed when Harrison married Veronica Ashford in 2017. Old money family, connections in finance and real estate. Beautiful woman who looked at manufacturing like it was beneath her. At their wedding reception, she pulled me aside. "Harrison says you're indispensable," she smiled. How quaint. Something in her tone made my skin crawl. Within 6 months, Harrison started talking about bringing in outside consultants. "Fresh perspective," he explained. The consultants were Veronica's former colleagues from her investment banking days. They spoke about synergy and optimization, words that sounded important but meant cutting costs and maximizing profit at any expense. I watched them study our operations with cold eyes that had never built anything. The first major change came in 2019. Harrison wanted to move production overseas to cut labor costs. I argued against it in a board meeting, explaining how quality control would suffer, how our reputation was built on American manufacturing, how our clients valued reliability over cheap prices. "Marcus is stuck in the past," Veronica said from her seat at the table. She'd somehow become a board advisor despite knowing nothing about our industry. "The market is evolving." Harrison sided with her. We moved 40% of production to a facility in Vietnam. Within a year, defect rates tripled. Our oldest clients started complaining. I spent months fixing the problems, flying to Vietnam quarterly, rebuilding relationships Harrison's cost-cutting had damaged. I never said I told you so. Just fixed it quietly. But I noticed things shifting. Harrison stopped asking my opinion in meetings. Started bringing Veronica to strategy sessions where she'd interrupt with financial projections that ignored operational reality. My office, once next to Harrison's, got relocated during a renovation to the opposite end of the building. In early 2023, Harrison announced we'd hired a new chief strategy officer. His name was Douglas Pemberton, another one of Veronica's connections. Slick guy, expensive suits, Harvard MBA prominently displayed in his office. Marcus, Douglas will be handling our growth initiatives, Harrison told me over lunch. You focus on keeping operations running smoothly. Translation: stay in your lane. Douglas immediately started pushing for aggressive expansion, acquiring smaller competitors, taking on debt to finance growth. I reviewed his projections and saw problems. The numbers assumed perfect execution, no market disruptions, no integration challenges. Reality was never that clean. These acquisition targets are overvalued, I told Harrison privately. We'd be buying companies with outdated equipment and weak client relationships. The debt load is risky. Harrison's jaw tightened. Douglas has done this before. Trust the process. That phrase became his mantra. Trust the process. Don't question Douglas. Don't slow down progress. Just keep the factories running while they made the real decisions. By mid-2023, I knew I was being pushed out. Meetings happened without me. Decisions got made that affected operations, but nobody asked my input until implementation started failing. Young executives Douglas hired looked at me like I was a relic, some old guy who didn't understand modern business. But I understood plenty. I understood that Apex's success was built on relationships, quality, and reliability. I understood that our clients didn't care about Harvard MBAs or financial engineering. They cared about getting their orders on time, built to specification, at a fair price. So I started documenting everything. Every questionable decision, every ignored warning, every financial projection that didn't match operational reality. I'd learned from William Blake to keep records. Paper trail protects you, he'd said. Memory fades, but documents don't. I created backups of emails, meeting notes, financial reports. Stored copies in secure locations Harrison's IT department couldn't access. Not because I planned revenge. Because I knew the truth eventually mattered. The breaking point came in November 2023. Douglas pushed through an acquisition of Titan Fasteners, a competitor in Ohio. $45 million deal, mostly financed with debt. I reviewed Titan's books and found serious problems. Equipment was obsolete, major clients were leaving, and their inventory was inflated on paper but worthless in reality. This is a bad deal, I told Harrison directly. Titan is failing for reasons that won't change under our ownership. We'd be buying their problems, not their assets. Harrison's face went red. You're undermining Douglas at every turn. Maybe you're just threatened by new leadership. I'm trying to protect the company William built, I said quietly. This acquisition will hurt us. 2 weeks later, we bought Titan. Harrison and Douglas celebrated with champagne in the executive conference room. Veronica posted photos on social media showing them toasting success. I wasn't invited to the celebration. The next morning, I started documenting everything about the Titan deal. Every warning I'd given, every financial red flag I'd identified, every operational concern I'd raised. Integration of Titan began in December. As I predicted, it was a disaster. Their equipment broke constantly. Their remaining clients were unhappy and started canceling contracts. Their employees, promised job security, began quitting when they realized Apex was just another corporate buyer. Douglas blamed the operational team. Execution problems, he called it in meetings. Marcus's people aren't moving fast enough. My people were working overtime trying to salvage his bad decision. I kept my mouth shut and kept documenting. By January 2024, the Titan acquisition had cost us $8 million beyond the purchase price. Douglas's projections showed we'd be profitable within 6 months. Reality showed we'd be lucky to break even in 3 years. Harrison grew distant. Stopped responding to my emails. When we passed in the hallway, he'd nod without speaking. I knew what was coming. The only question was when. February brought my answer. Harrison called me into his office with Vanessa present. The termination speech lasted 90 seconds. No severance beyond the legal minimum. No acknowledgement of 25 years. No thank you for building the company alongside his father. Just corporate efficiency. Security walked me to my office and watched while I packed personal items. My assistant, Claire, cried quietly at her desk. She'd worked with me for 12 years. "This is wrong," she whispered as I passed. I smiled. "It's business. Take care of yourself." In my car, I sat for a moment, looking at the building I'd helped expand 3 times. The loading docks I'd redesigned. The quality control systems I'd implemented. All of it still running because I'd built it properly. Then I drove home, where my wife Angela was waiting. "They let you go?" she asked, reading my face. I nodded. "Harrison's mistake," she said firmly. Angela knew me well enough to understand that my calm wasn't surrender. That night, I reviewed everything I'd gathered over the past year. Emails showing I'd warned against the overseas expansion that failed. Documents proving I'd identified problems with the Titan acquisition that were now costing millions. Financial projections from Douglas that bore no resemblance to actual results. Meeting minutes showing my concerns were dismissed repeatedly. More importantly, I'd found something else. During routine financial reviews, I'd noticed irregular consulting payments. Harrison had hired a firm called Strategic Advancement Partners, paying them $75,000 monthly for services that were never clearly defined. I'd asked about it once. "Advisory services," Harrison said vaguely. "High-level strategy stuff." I dug deeper using access I'd had as COO before they terminated me. Strategic Advancement Partners was registered in Delaware with minimal public information. But the bank account receiving payments belonged to a company owned by Douglas Pemberton. Harrison was paying Douglas's personal company $900,000 annually on top of his salary, disguised as consulting fees. That was just the beginning. Over the next week, I traced more money. Strategic Advancement Partners had received $2.7 million over 3 years. But there was another company, Pemberton Holdings LLC, receiving equipment lease payments. Apex was leasing machinery we already owned, paying Pemberton's company to use our own assets. The scheme was sophisticated. They'd transferred ownership of certain equipment to Pemberton's holding company during the Vietnam expansion, then leased it back to Apex at inflated rates. On paper, it looked like a legitimate sale-leaseback arrangement to free up capital. In reality, it was Douglas siphoning money while Harrison either participated or was too incompetent to notice. I compiled everything into a detailed report. Bank statements, corporate registrations, email trails showing Douglas recommended the arrangements that benefited his personal companies. The total came to $4.8 million diverted over 3 years. I had everything backed up in 3 separate secure locations. Hard copies in a safety deposit box, encrypted digital files in cloud storage, and copies with my attorney. Then I waited. The annual shareholders meeting was scheduled for March 15th. Apex was privately held, but we had outside investors who owned 35% of the company. William had brought them in years ago to fund expansion. They were passive investors mostly, trusting Harrison to run operations. I contacted the lead investor, Thomas Whitmore. He'd been William's friend, someone who believed in the company's original mission. "Marcus, I heard you left," Thomas said when he answered. "Retired," I replied. "But I wanted to share some concerns about the company's direction before the shareholders' meeting." We met at his office downtown. I brought printed copies of everything. Thomas reviewed the documents in silence, his expression darkening. "Douglas Pemberton is stealing from the company?" he asked finally. "The evidence suggests he's been diverting funds through shell companies. Harrison either knows and is complicit, or he's been incompetent in his oversight." Thomas leaned back. "This is serious, Marcus. If this is true, it's fraud. Why bring it to me instead of the authorities?" "Because William built this company," I said. "It meant something. I want to give the board a chance to clean house before outsiders get involved." Thomas called an emergency board meeting for March 10th, 5 days before the shareholders' meeting. He didn't tell Harrison why, just said they needed to review financial performance. I wasn't invited, but Thomas kept me informed. Harrison and Douglas arrived confident, expecting routine questions. Thomas opened with the consulting payments to strategic advancement partners. "These fees seem high," Thomas noted. "What exactly are we getting for $900,000 annually?" Douglas launched into corporate speak about strategic positioning and market analysis. His explanation lasted 5 minutes and said nothing concrete. "Show me the deliverables," Thomas interrupted. "Reports, analysis, documentation of this strategic work." Douglas hesitated. "Most of it is high-level advisory, not always documented in traditional formats." Another board member, Patricia Kovacs, spoke up. She ran her own manufacturing company and had known William. "Douglas, I've been in this industry 40 years. I've hired consultants. They provide reports, presentations, analysis. You're describing expensive conversations." The room grew tense. Harrison jumped in, defending Douglas, but his explanations were vague. Thomas then dropped the real information. The equipment lease payments to Pemberton Holdings. The ownership transfers that made no operational sense. The pattern of money flowing from Apex to Douglas's personal entities. "These payments total $4.8 million over 3 years, Thomas said, sliding documents across the table. "Money paid to companies Douglas owns or controls." Harrison's face went pale. Douglas stood abruptly. "This is a misunderstanding of legitimate business arrangements." "My attorney will—" "Sit down," Patricia said coldly. "We're not done." For 2 hours, they dissected every transaction. Douglas tried to justify each payment, but his explanations contradicted each other. Harrison claimed ignorance, saying he'd trusted Douglas to handle financial structuring. "Who provided this information?" Harrison finally asked, his voice shaking. Thomas smiled. "Someone who actually cares about this company." By the end of the meeting, the board had voted to suspend Douglas immediately and place Harrison on probationary status pending further investigation. They also voted to postpone the shareholders' meeting by 2 weeks to allow time for a full financial audit. Harrison called me that night. "You did this," he said without preamble. "You destroyed everything." "I documented fraud," I replied calmly. "There's a difference." Douglas made some questionable decisions, but he was helping us grow. "You're just bitter about being let go." I almost laughed. "Harrison, your father trusted me to protect this company. That didn't stop when you fired me. My father would be ashamed of you sabotaging his legacy." The word stung, but I kept my voice steady. "Your father would be ashamed that you let someone steal from the company he built. That you were too busy playing CEO to notice you were being robbed." Harrison hung up. 3 days later, Douglas Pemberton was escorted from the building by police. The board had filed criminal complaints for fraud and embezzlement. The evidence I'd provided formed the basis of the investigation. Veronica posted on social media about unfair treatment of innocent executives, claiming Douglas was being scapegoated. Nobody bought it. The documents were too clear, the pattern too obvious. The shareholders meeting finally happened on March 29th. I attended as a guest of Thomas Whitmore, sitting in the back row while Harrison presented his version of events. He blamed Douglas entirely, painted himself as a victim of a sophisticated con artist, and promised reforms to prevent future problems. "We've learned valuable lessons," Harrison said, his voice confident despite everything. "Apex Industries will emerge stronger from this challenge." Then Thomas stood for the investor question period. "Harrison, how did you not notice $4.8 million in irregular payments over 3 years?" Harrison fumbled through an answer about trusting his executive team and focusing on strategic growth. Thomas pressed harder. "These payments were in regular financial reports. Did you review them?" "My CFO handled detailed financial oversight," Harrison said defensively. Patricia spoke next. "Your CFO reported to you. The buck stops at the CEO. Either you knew and participated, or you were incompetent. Which is it?" The room went silent. Harrison's face reddened. "I made mistakes in oversight, but my intentions—" "Intentions don't matter when millions are stolen," Thomas interrupted. "William Blake built this company on integrity. Under your leadership, that integrity disappeared." Harrison looked desperately around the room for support. The other shareholders, mostly silent until now, stared back with hard eyes. These were people who'd invested money trusting William's vision. "I'm calling for a vote of no confidence," Thomas announced. "Harrison Blake should be removed as CEO effective immediately." The room erupted. Harrison stood, shouting about his rights as majority shareholder, about family legacy, about betrayal. Veronica, sitting beside him, grabbed his arm, whispering urgently. But the mathematics were clear. William had sold 35% of the company to raise expansion capital. Those investors, now united, could make Harrison's position untenable even if they couldn't technically remove him. "You can't do this," Harrison said, his voice breaking. "This is my father's company." "Actually," I said, speaking for the first time from the back of the room. Everyone turned. "It's William's company, and he'd want it protected." Harrison stared at me with pure hatred. You destroyed me because I fired you. This is just revenge." I walked slowly to the front of the room. "I documented criminal activity. The fact that you fired me first just proves you valued loyalty to Douglas over loyalty to this company." Thomas handed me the microphone. I looked at the assembled shareholders, people who'd trusted William, who'd invested in his vision. 25 years ago, William Blake gave me a chance when I was nobody. He taught me that integrity isn't what you do when people are watching. It's what you do when nobody would ever know. When I found evidence of fraud, I had a choice. Stay silent to protect my own reputation, or speak up to protect what William built. The choice was easy. Patricia stood, applauding. Others joined. Not for me, but for the principle. For the idea that some things mattered more than politics or personal advancement. Harrison slumped in his chair, defeated. Veronica had already gathered her things, preparing to leave. "What happens now?" someone asked. Thomas answered. "We've negotiated a settlement. Harrison will step down as CEO, retaining his ownership stake but relinquishing operational control. The board will install interim leadership while we search for a permanent replacement." Harrison looked up, broken. "And Marcus? Does he get my job as his reward?" "Marcus isn't interested in your job," Thomas said. "He's interested in stability." That was true. At 52, I didn't want to start over as CEO. I wanted the company to survive and honor William's memory. However, Thomas continued, the board has asked Marcus to return as Chief Operating Officer, with expanded authority to oversee financial controls and corporate governance. I'd negotiated this carefully. Not a promotion to CEO, which would look like a power grab. Just a return to the role I'd excelled at, with additional responsibility to prevent future fraud. Marcus will report directly to the board and the new CEO, Thomas explained. He'll have authority to flag concerns without fear of retaliation. The shareholders voted. Harrison was removed as CEO by unanimous consent of the outside investors. The meeting ended in chaos. Shareholders clustered in small groups, discussing the implications. Reporters who'd gotten wind of the drama waited outside. Harrison and Veronica left through a side exit, avoiding questions. I stood with Thomas and Patricia, feeling exhausted. You could have kept quiet, Patricia said. Taken your severance and moved on. William wouldn't have, I replied simply. Thomas nodded. He chose well when he hired you. Not many people would risk their reputation to do the right thing. But I hadn't risked my reputation. I documented facts, presented evidence, and let the truth speak. The risk was to Harrison's ego and Douglas's freedom, not to my integrity. That night, Angela and I sat on our porch, watching the sunset. So you're going back? She asked. For a while. Until things stabilize. Until I'm sure the company will survive. She squeezed my hand. William would be proud. Maybe. Or maybe he'd just expect it. That was the thing about integrity. It wasn't something you chose when it was convenient. It was who you were. Douglas Pemberton was indicted 3 months later on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. His attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the evidence was overwhelming. He eventually pleaded guilty to avoid trial and received 7 years in federal prison. The money was largely unrecoverable, spent on luxury purchases and high-risk investments that had failed. Apex absorbed the loss and moved forward. Harrison stayed on as a shareholder but had no operational role. He and Veronica divorced within a year. She'd apparently married him for the CEO lifestyle, not the disgraced former executive reality. The company hired a new CEO, Victoria Hayes, with 20 years of manufacturing experience and a reputation for ethical leadership. She and I worked together to rebuild what Douglas had damaged. The Titan acquisition was sold at a loss, but we cut our ongoing bleeding. The Vietnam facility was restructured with better quality controls. Our reputation slowly recovered. Clients who'd left returned when they saw we were serious about fixing our problems. By the end of 2024, Apex was stable again, smaller but healthier. I stayed on for 2 years, helping Victoria implement new governance structures and financial controls. We created systems where no single executive could make major decisions without oversight, where multiple people reviewed significant expenditures, where transparency mattered more than hierarchy. Claire, my former assistant, was promoted to operations manager. She'd been loyal during the hardest times, and loyalty deserved reward. On my last day, Victoria called me into her office. "You know the board wants you to stay," she said. "This company needs people like you." I smiled. This company needs new energy. I'm 54 and tired. I've done what I came back to do. She handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter from the board, thanking me for my service and integrity. It also contained a substantial bonus, recognition for the years I'd given without proper appreciation. "William would have wanted you to have this," Thomas had written in a personal note. I thought about William often, about the young man who'd believed in me, who'd taught me that doing the right thing mattered more than doing the easy thing. My last walk through the facility felt surreal. I'd helped design these production lines, hired most of the supervisors, solved 1,000 problems in these rooms. Workers nodded respectfully as I passed. Some thanked me for saving their jobs. The loading dock supervisor, Miguel stopped me. "Mr. Thompson, we heard what you did. How you could have just walked away but didn't." I shrugged. "Someone had to." "Most people wouldn't have," he said seriously. "You saved this place." "I didn't save anything. I just refused to let lies become truth, refused to let theft become standard practice, refused to let William's legacy get destroyed by his son's incompetence." That wasn't heroism. It was just baseline decency. But I understood what Miguel meant. In a world where people looked the other way constantly, where convenience outweighed conscience, maybe decency seemed heroic. Maybe the bar had dropped so low that simply doing the right thing felt exceptional. Angela and I used the bonus money to buy a small cabin in northern Michigan. A place by a lake where I could fish and read and not think about production schedules or corporate fraud. Harrison sent me an email 2 years after I'd left. Brief and unexpected. "Marcus, I was angry for a long time. Blamed you for destroying my career. But I've had time to think. You were protecting my father's company from me. From my stupidity and pride. Thank you." I didn't reply immediately. Spent a few days considering whether any response was needed. Eventually, I wrote back, "Your father was a good man who believed people were redeemable. Hope you find what you're looking for." I meant it. Anger was exhausting, and I'd never been angry at Harrison personally. Disappointed, yes. Frustrated by his weakness and vanity. But not angry. He'd been a mediocre executive who'd gotten in over his head, not a malicious criminal. Douglas was the predator. Harrison was just prey who happened to have authority. The difference mattered. Now, at 56, I spend my mornings fishing and my afternoons reading. Angela and I travel occasionally, visit our daughter in Chicago, live quietly. People sometimes ask if I regret how things went, if I wish I'd stayed silent and kept my job. The answer is always no. 25 years of loyalty wasn't about Harrison or Apex Industries. It was about honoring William Blake's trust, about protecting something that mattered, about proving that integrity wasn't just a word people used in mission statements. I didn't get my revenge by destroying Harrison. I got my peace by doing what was right and living with the consequences. The shareholders' meeting didn't silence everyone because of dramatic revelations. It silenced them because the truth was undeniable, documented, and devastating. Sometimes the quietest response is the most powerful one. Sometimes refusing to argue, simply presenting facts and letting them speak, wins every battle worth fighting. And sometimes loyalty means protecting someone's legacy even from their own children. William Blake taught me that. I just finally understood the lesson.